Next, the Moncada attack. Antonio Rafael de la Cova recounts Fidel Castro's failed attack on the Cuban army in 1953, which led to the birth of the Cuban Revolution. This is about an hour, 40 minutes.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Juan Clark from Miami-Dade Community College, and an old friend of Professor de la Cova, Tony, as we like to call him. It's indeed a real pleasure and an honor to introduce this evening this very unique book. I would say very unique because it is in the way in which it was made and with the subject that it deals with. Indeed, I think that we have here something that anyone that is interested in studying the Cuban Revolution must read this book, because Professor de la Cova has actually researched in a very exhaustive way the origins of that revolutionary process, which was the Moncada attack. And he does that in a very academic way, but at the same time, very easy reading. It has a lot of footnotes. I like footnotes. The only thing I don't like about the footnotes is that sometimes they are at the end. But you don't have to read the footnotes, although I would say I highly recommend that you read them because they are not only bibliographical notes, but also they are explanatory notes that expand on many of the things that Professor de la Cova has actually written. I would like to say a couple of words about also the way in which the book was made. 31 years of research. It says very fast, but I know what it means because I have been working myself in my book now, going into the English version, and I know what it means, that amount of time. Tony has to be praised and to be thankful to him for the work that he has accomplished. I would say that is, as I was saying initially, unique because it presents this tragedy of Cuba in a very objective way. He deals with both sides of the picture, something that no other book dealing with this particular subject has done. And I think that indeed in Cuba and here in the United States, this book is bound to be a bestseller. And I only wish that we could have very soon the Spanish version of this book, because I think the people in Cuba are very much still into the myth of what happened there. And precisely Professor de la Cova deals with this issue of the myths and destroys those myths in a very objective way, in a very academic way. So we have here what I would call a historic treasure, a historic treasure. I have read it from cover to cover already, and I can assure you that this is a masterpiece, and we have to be thankful to Tony, and we have to be very grateful that he has made this fantastic contribution to the history of Cuba and this process that is going into its 50th anniversary pretty soon. Thank you, Tony, and you're going to make a presentation that is really fantastic, so I don't have anything more to say. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Professor Clark. I want to thank Books and Books for putting together this presentation. I want to thank C-SPAN Books TV, and I want to thank all of you that are here. There are people here I had not seen in over 30 years. So it was heartwarming to see some of you. There are other people here who participate in these events. There's Raul Martinez Araraz over here, who was actually Castro's right-hand man during the preparation of the attack and who led the rebels at Bayamo. Raul, will you please stand up? Thank you. So there are number of other people here, relatives of other participants here, but I don't want to take up any more time. I want to, first of all, describe what the book consists of. It took 31 years of academic research in which there were 115 taped and transcribed interviews with direct participants. 14 were rebel attackers, 47 military and police defenders, 54 politicians and civilians that were implicated, including the judge that presided the trial over the rebels and sentenced Fidel Castro, 4 defense attorneys, the funeral home director, Manuel Bartolomé, who retrieved the rebel and military dead, doctors who attended the wounded, the farmers, the family of Manuel Leizan, who mediated the surrender of Fidel Castro and the last group of 7 rebels, and notified Archbishop Pérez Cerantes so that he could intervene. And I also found declassified U.S. government documents that I acquired through Freedom of Information Act, which were very interesting. The American Embassy in Havana kept very close watch on what was going on in Cuba, mostly out of fear of communist infiltration in the country. And they kept watch over many of the political groups. So it's a whole area of research that had never been dwelt into before. Also, I used 53 different newspapers and magazines and 132 books in Spanish, English, and French. Okay, who is Fidel Castro? Very complex person. He grew up under 3 different names. He was the son of a wealthy sugar and plantation owner. His father had 26,000 acre plantation and his own little fiefdom there in Biran in Oriente province. His father was married to another woman with whom he had 2 children, so Castro was raised in his early years in the shack of his mother. And he did not have a birth certificate, he did not have a baptismal certificate, and this of course meant that he could not get into Catholic schools unless his father shelled out a lot of money. But as you can see, the record shows he had 3 different names. Fidel Hipólito Ruz González was his first name, and Hipólito was the Haitian consul in Santiago de Cuba who became his godfather when he was baptized at the age of 6 years old. Later, his name was changed to Fidel Casiano Ruz González when they finally got a birth certificate for him. Again, he's using both his mother's last name because the father was married to another woman. After the father got divorced in 1941, then Castro, his father finally decided to recognize him. Castro, by the time his father recognized him, a couple of years after he got married, Castro was already 17 years old. This, of course, created a lot of resentment in Castro toward his father. They never got along. And you can see here some images of Castro as a child. Here is here's Fidel here, his older brother Ramon, and younger brother Raúl when they were in school in Santiago de Cuba. By the way, Raúl's nickname was La Pulguita, or the flea, as you can see from his size. And by the way, I also go into, in the book, into his background. It appears that his biological father was a local corporal in Central Miranda. the children were inculcated with the father's anti-American hatred. His father had been a Spaniard during the, his Spanish father had been a soldier during the Spanish-American War. And as a result, as many of the Spanish War veterans, they always held a hatred toward the United States, and so Castro grew up with this anti-American hatred. Kind of reminds me of some Southerners that grew up listening to Damn Yankee, okay? And they think it's one word instead of two. Okay. All right, Castro had contempt for his parents. He has been quoted as saying by Lee Lockwood that they were ignorant people without an education. His mother, Lina Ruz, was a 13-year-old illiterate household servant when his 47-year-old father seduced her. And she gave birth to 7 children. The father sent Fidel to elitist schools. He wanted him to be an attorney because he was constantly having legal problems over property matters. And so he wanted his son to represent him on these issues. So he sent him to the best schools they were. And unfortunately for Castro, this prompted an inferiority complex and social resentment. And I quote in the book one of his closest friends at the time, Enrique Juarez, whose widow happens to be here with us. And Juarez told me, he said, you know, the worst thing Castro's parents did was send him to an elitist school where he felt very inferior and, you know, developed all these resentments. We see that by the age of 11, Castro is expelled from La Salle because he got in a fight with a school disciplinarian. He punched him and bit him. And because of the father's money, to be able to get him into La Salle, they had to create a special grade. He said, when he was interviewed by Fray Beto in 1985, he said that La Salle created a special grade for him and Ramon and Raul in the school. He said, well, this was a special grade. Actually, the old man was shelling out a lot of money so that his out-of-wedlock children who did not have birth certificates could be taught there separately from other kids. And this is part of the resentment that he had. He developed into a manipulator and liar by the age of 14. And this is the first documentation of Castro being a liar and a manipulator. This letter that in November 6th of 1940, he sent using the Colegio Loro stationery, Santiago, Cuba, to President Franklin Roosevelt. And as you can see in this letter, he calls him my good friend Roosevelt. And here is the first documented lie when he says, I am 12 years old. Castro's first documented lie. He was 14 at the time. He's writing in English. Yeah, because he was born August 1926, so by November 1940, he's not 12, he's 14. First documented lie. And then he goes on to say in the letter here, if you like, give me a $10 bill, green American, in the letter. He's asking the president of a foreign nation to send him $10. Now, let's remember, this is 1940. That would be today about the equivalent of $100. Now, what school kid today writes to the president and asks for a $100 bill? Okay, so we can see how manipulative he was. Anyways, he did a number of other hijinks. He claimed that he lost his report card and kept it and would give himself A's to show his parents so that he could be rewarded. Anyways, he did tell Fray Beto that he rejected religious meditation. He called it mental terrorism. And In Belen High School, they nicknamed him the Rube, El Guajiro, and also the Madman, El Loco. So again, this was all part of him not fitting into this society that he came to hate and despise. And we see in one of his prison letters where Castro wrote to Luis Contaguero from prison, where he says, "I would love to turn this country upside down." When Castro is sent to the University of Havana to study law, he teams up with the Insurrectional Revolutionary Union, a gangster group led by Emilio Tro in 1946. By the time he's 21 years old, he has already been accused of murdering Manolo de Castro, Oscar Fernandez Caral, and the attempted murder of Leonel Gomez, 1946, and Rolando Massaret, 1948. There you see Castro in the center. This is Armando Gali Menendez in the back. This is Rafael del Pino, who would later go with him to the Bogotazo. And there is one humorous anecdote where his first attempted murder of Leonel Gomez, he stood on the wall of the university on Ronda Street, and when he saw Leonel walk by, he started shooting at him, and he missed, and he wounded him, and he wounded another bystander on the leg, Fernando Frey de Andrade. And so, as Enrico Vares later told me, he said, the big joke in the university was that Frey de Andrade was nicknamed La Vaquita, the little cow. And so the big joke in the university was he went gunning for the bull, but instead hit the little cow. In July 1947, Castro ran the first and only student election that he ran for, and he was defeated 144 votes to 19 by Alfredo Guevara, who was a communist. And they were both running for secretary of the University Constituent Assembly. So this is when Castro realized, well, elections are not for me. And this also, Castro decided, well, the electoral route is not for me. In November 1947, the students decide that they're going to hold an anti-government rally at the University of Havana. So they want to get the bell of La de Majagua right here that rang the start of Cuba's 10 years war for independence. And so a delegation is sent to the city of Manzanillo, where the city council held the relic. And Castro and the others lied to them. They said, we want to bring the bell to the university to commemorate student martyrs. Yet, when the bell arrived in Havana, and you see Castro here making a silly face, and here's Enrico Vares, who is president of the University Student Federation. Here is El Chino Esquivel, who is another one of his running partners. And this is Gustavo Ortiz Fáez. By the following year, both Ortiz Fáez and Fidel Castro would be implicated in the murder of Manolo de Castro. But they got the bell to the university, and instead of using it in a rally to commemorate the student martyrs, they used it as an anti-government rally. So again, this is part of that, his nature of deceit and trickery that we see throughout his life. He participated in the Cayo Confites expedition to invade Santo Domingo. In 1947, he participated in the Bogotazo. Here's the Bogotazo riot in 1948. And he was really exuberant about this, participating in the riot. The other members of the delegation, you see here, here's Castro. Here, Rafael del Pino is directly behind him. This is Enrico Vares, and this was a Mexican student delegate that attended. But of the 4 Cubans that were there for a student congress, only Castro and Rafael del Pino joined the mobs in rioting. Now, this is what really spawned in Castro this mentality of military interventionism that we will see is a cornerstone of Cuba's foreign policy after Castro seizes power. You know, the invasion of the Dominican Republic, the rioting in Bogota. And when he returned to Cuba, and this is interesting, that the communist newspaper, Hoy, never quoted him. When he came back, all the statements he made to the press, communist newspapers always ignored him. Hoy always ignored him. They quoted all the statements of Enrique Vares and Alfredo Guevara. Alfredo Guevara was a communist, but they ridiculed Castro. They called him a budding Jesuit because he was attending Belén Jesuit School. In October 1948, he married Mirta Diaz-Balart. The wedding was in a Catholic church in the town of Banes, where her family is from. And Castro's father did not attend his son's wedding. Again, we see here this distancing between father and son. Okay, because Mirta's father was attorney for Fulgencio Batista, Batista sent him a $1,000 wedding gift, which Castro, of course, did not reject. And he also does not tell biographers about that. They honeymooned in New York during 1 month, and the following year, their son, Fidel Angel Castro, was born in Havana. He got a law degree on October 13, 1950, but during the 3 years that he practiced law, he only had 2 legal cases, and they were related to his father's estate. So he has acknowledged that the reason he became a lawyer was because of family pressure. He said that he would have wanted to have been something else, and that, as Mario Chanes told me, he said Castro should have been an actor. Now, he had presidential aspirations through the Ortodoxo Party as representative in the June of 1952 elections, but the party ticket was never formulated before March 10 of 1952, when Fulgencio Batista leads a coup d'etat in Cuba and takes over the government. The Batista coup accelerated Castro's revolutionary aspirations. Here, this is exactly what he needed to carry out his plans. He began recruiting followers within the Ortodoxo Party youth. And these were people that came mostly from humble and lowly backgrounds. They had less than a 6th grade education. These were people that had been neglected. They had menial jobs such as parking lot attendants, street vendors, street musician, and others. And of course, Castro stood out above all of them. He was an attorney. He always recruited people over whom he could tower. He never recruited university students. He never recruited people at his own level, the same educational level, because they would argue his propositions, whereas these other people were very easy to manipulate. And so Castro then begins his anti-Batista propaganda. He's trying to carry out a traditional revolution by reaching out to the masses, but it becomes impossible for him because, first of all, he acquires a very limited shortwave radio, which had a broadcast of less than 1 mile in Havana. They did 2 radio broadcasts before the authorities seized it. And he also published a 4-page mimeograph bulletin, only about 500 copies. Cuba at the time had a population of 6 million people. So you can see his message was not getting out there to the people. So he had to look for other ways to be known. And he began to have his followers carry out target practice in different farms, rock quarries in Havana, at the university, and they did so with weapons acquired in hardware stores, 22 caliber rifles, shotguns, handguns, and as one of the rebels told me, Gerardo Granados, he said that all they had was a handgun with 5 bullets. And he told me, he says, I didn't shoot because I wanted the others to become enthusiastic in shooting. And I asked him, well, did you train with a rifle? No. Did you train with a shotgun? No. So he went to the attack carrying a 22 caliber handgun. Others went to the attack with a weapon they did not train with. As Mario Chanes told me, as they were leaving the C1A farmhouse ready to attack the Moncada, says another rebel walked up to him with a .22 rifle and says, hey, how does this work? He just says, don't ask me. Now, after the political opposition made the Montreal Pact on June 2nd, 1953, and this was the Ortodoxos and Auténtico Party that gathered in Montreal, Canada, to carry out make a clandestine plan to carry out a military revolt against Batista. Castro then decided to accelerate his plans. As you can see, he would carry out his own attack scarcely 7 weeks later. So he just basically had 7 weeks in which to plan an attack on an army fortress. And so I've looked at the motivation that the rebels had. And it was really very heterogeneous. It was a very mixed group that was here. First of all, the Ortodoxo Party camaraderie and their democratic ideology. This is what prompted them. Also, there was a revolutionary tradition in Cuba from the 1930s. Those who had fought against President Gerardo Machado had reached, like Carlos Perillo, the highest office, the presidency. Somebody that had been accused of throwing bombs and fighting against the regime was now president. So this generation saw themselves in that light. They saw themselves in the light of the Mambises, the Cuban independence fighters. And they wanted the restoration of the 1940 Constitution that had been abolished by Batista. Some were motivated by very strong idealism, including Raul Martinez. Raul Martinez was living here with his wife in Miami Beach. After the Batista coup, he says, we have to go back to Cuba and do something. We have to fight against the dictatorship. Now that, is very strong idealism. How many people would do that today, right? When you have a wife and kids, and you're going to get involved with something like this? There were others, of course. Others had personal aspirations. Renato Guitart here from Santiago aspired to be a colonel. 2 weeks before the attack, he was bragging to his friends, hey, don't be surprised if you see me in a couple of weeks now with the rank of a colonel on my shoulders. Okay? Guitart had a facial disfigurement here that worsened when he received cobalt treatment. And as a result of this, he was very conscious of this, and he often got in fistfights. People would stare at him, and he'd snap back. What are you staring at? And had a very irascible character, according to people that knew him. And sitting up here in the front row is his former friend, Pepín Pujol, that knew Renato. Went to school together. Of the 160 rebels, there were 7 that had previous criminal records, had been in problem with the law, and one aspect that I found here very interesting was that 23 of them had been raised without a father. Okay. I'm not a psychologist or sociologist. I don't know how that figures in the mind of these rebels. I have found the information, and that's for others to study. But I think that's a very important factor, that these young men that were raised without a father, how did they view Fidel Castro? 160 rebels then were transferred to Oriente Province on Friday, July 24th. They went from Havana here to the eastern end of the island in Oriente. And they traveled in cars, their own cars, rental cars, trains, buses, and I think only about 2 or 3 of the rebels actually knew what was going to happen, because Fidel Castro did not tell the overwhelming majority of the rebels why they were going to Oriente. Now, on the way there, down here's Santiago de Cuba, and here is Bayamo. On the way there, a few rebels defected, because they kept asking, what's this all about? Where are we going? What's the purpose of this? And he refused to tell them. So there was about 5 or 6 that left on the way there. 135 of them went to Santiago de Cuba, where they would attack the Moncada garrison, and 25 went to Bayamo, which was the group that Raúl Martínez Araraz led. Because there was a carnival going on in Santiago de Cuba that weekend, it did not arouse suspicion that this large number of strangers was arriving in the city. Castro had previously rented this farmhouse near Siboney, 8 miles from Santiago de Cuba. When he gathered the rebels there, he distributed the same hardware store weaponry that they had trained with, and army uniforms that had been purloined from the laundry at Camp Columbia by one of the rebels who happened to be an orderly at the hospital. Castro then revealed the plan of attacking the Moncada fortress and the simultaneous attack on the Bayamo barracks with 22 caliber rifles, shotguns, and handguns. And it's interesting to read, even General Juan Almeida, general in Cuba today, said that when he saw that they were going to attack a military garrison with a 22 caliber rifle, he said his heart froze, and that he had to massage his heart because he was in such shock. 14 rebels refused to participate at Siboney. They saw that Castro was lying. They saw that he was improvising. And as Angel Diaz Francisco, who was known as nicknamed Patachula, told me, he said, somebody asked Castro, well, what's going to happen if the Air Force comes and bombs us? And Castro said, oh, don't worry. He says, we got conspirators in the Air Force. So, and he just kept lying. Other people said, well, what happens if we get to the garrison and the doors to the dormitories are locked? He said, well, we'll just shoot the lock off. So again, he was improvising, and this is why 14 people, who by the way, 4 of them were university students that didn't even know that Castro was involved in this. Diaz Francisco told me that Pedro Miret had invited him and said, hey, there's a arms shipment in Oriente. It's going to be delivered, and they're going to distribute the weapons out to different revolutionary groups. That's why he went along. When he saw Fidel Castro there, he says, I want no part of this. I know this guy. And another interesting aspect of this is that Castro appointed all the rebels. He said, you all now have the rank of sergeants. But he did not choose a rank for himself. He did appoint Raul Martinez colonel, and but he did not take a rank for himself. Okay, here's an outline of the Moncada garrison right here in the. You can see in the black the heavy outline here. Here's the Moncada garrison. The main entrances. The post 1 is here. This is gate 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, what the plan consisted of was that at 5:20 a.m., a caravan of rebel vehicles would come down the side street here. They would breach the side gate here, disguised as soldiers, and they would park in front of each of the 5 barracks here. Then they would rush in and, purportedly catch the soldiers asleep and tie them up and take over the garrison. And at the same time, Abel Santamaria and 24 rebels would take over the civil hospital here, move to the back area, and from here snipe on the garrison. Okay, then they would also seize the Palace of Justice, right here, the courthouse, and from here snipe on the garrison. Castro thought that, well, if we rush the barracks and they flee out the back, that they would get sniped on from the hospital and the Palace of Justice. But at the time, there were only, there were less than 400 soldiers in this garrison because many of the soldiers went home to sleep. So it's an undetermined amount, but I'd say it was about 300 or less in the garrison. Another interesting aspect is, okay, and you can see here from this mock-up layout of the garrison, here's the garrison. The first wing here had offices, and then these were the barracks of the service company and other units. This was the machine gun company here and the Royal Guard barracks. This was military housing here on the side and military housing along here. On the outside was the military hospital right here. And you can see the civil hospital in the back. And this is where they took up positions to fire on the garrison. Here is the courthouse from where they planned on shooting at the garrison. Behind the garrison right here, behind the garrison here, is the small arms target range that we'll talk about later. Could you go back a moment to the... Okay, I just wanted to point out here where the garrison is. Here's Pujol Motors, Harley-Davidson dealership that Pepin Pujol owned at the time, he and his brother. Okay, when the rebel caravan heads to Santiago, what happened was that as they came from Siboney in this direction, when they reached this intersection right here, Ernesto Tisol, who was the military chief of the attackers and who did not know of this plan, decided, time to go home. And as Raul Martinez would later tell me, he defected, he deserted. So as he drove off, once he got here, he drove off Las Americas Avenue, ended up here in Quintero Heights, and deviated half the caravan with him, followed him. So you have half the caravan continues over here toward the Moncada garrison, a part of the caravan, and about half of it ended up out here in Quintero Heights. So of the 90 rebels that are going to attack the Moncada, not counting the ones in the civil hospital, or the 6 in the Palace of Justice, they got deviated from the route, and most of them never made it. Okay, the 5 rebels that were in the lead car finally reached post 3, gate 3, right here in the garrison. There was a chain across, and they disarmed the 2 sentinels that were there. But because they were wearing shoddy military uniforms, they had put them on over the clothes. Some of them had tennis shoes on. They were wearing civilian belts. One had a J initial on the belt. They didn't have military haircuts. They looked like a motley crew. And of course, the corporal with the guard saw that they were phonies and rang the alarm bell inside this guard post. So immediately he was gunned down and killed. And the rebels then make the mistake, the 5 in the first car, make the mistake of leaving their car right at the entrance. Instead of proceeding in like they were supposed to and going to the last barracks, they left the car blocking the entrance. And then they run in, and what they were pursuing, they thought that they had terrible military intelligence, which kind of indicates, what Castro's real motive was. They thought that the quartermaster room was an arsenal and that all of the weapons of the garrison were stored there. They did not know that each barracks held the rifles, the Springfield rifles, of the soldiers assigned to that unit. So they were trying to enter the quartermaster room, and instead of going in here, the quartermaster room, the entrance was behind the doorway, they ran up the stairs. And they went into this hallway here and entrenched themselves in there. Only 5. The rest remained outside, and on one side of the gate of the street there, facing gate 3, were the houses. These were the houses of the sergeants assigned to the Moncada. Over here on the side, we have the military hospital, and back here is the courthouse. And so what happened was that as the cars were approaching the gate, and there are a number of things going on at the same time. As the first car is approaching the gate, there's a military patrol that comes down a side street unexpectedly. And at the same time, there's a soldier walking down the street, and Castro tells Gustavo Arcos, who's sitting behind him in the car, he says, "Detain that soldier." And just as Gustavo Arcos, as he told me in a telephone interview I had with him in 1997 when he was living in Havana, as he goes to step out of the car, Fidel Castro decides he's going to run over those 2 military patrol because they had Thompson machine guns, and he wanted to take them away. So as he tries to run them over, Arcos falls out of the car, rolls on the ground. The soldier on the sidewalk reaches for his gun. As he's pulling it out, Arcos shoots him a couple of times. But split seconds earlier is when the corporal of the guard gets killed at post 3. So the corporal guard is killed at post 3, and split seconds later, Arcos shoots the soldier that was walking there. And by the way, when I talked to Gustavo Arcos on the phone in 1997, he told me, he says, that's weighed on my mind for years, that I killed that man. And I said, Gustavo, you're not going to believe this, but he survived. He was not killed. And he says, no, I'm sure I killed him. I said, Gustavo, his name was Luis Frometa Naranjo. He ended up in the hospital. You didn't kill him. So he said, you've taken a big weight off my shoulders. He said, because that always bothered me. I thought that I had killed that man. Anyways, Castro as he lurches forward in his car, he hits the curb, the car stalls, and as he jumps out of the car, the rest of the rebels also bail out. They didn't know where they were. They thought that this was part of the garrison. All the houses are painted the same color. And as Hector de Armas told me, he said, you know, I'd been up for 36 hours. I was tired. I didn't know where I was. I was disoriented. People were running on the street. And Castro totally loses control of his troops right there in front of the gate. You can see in this photo here, here's the entrance to Gate 3. This is seen from the building. The first stairway here is where the rebels ran up into. Here's part of the military housing on this side, and there was on the other. The rebel caravan came down this way, and the lead car blocked the way here. Now, the rebels, when they jump out of the car, they started going into the military housing projects, thinking this is part of the garrison. They even ran into the military hospital. But there was a corporal that was there with a 45 caliber handgun under his pillow, and he came out and started blasting away and chased them out. I interviewed the two doctors that were on duty at the hospital at the time. Now, as soon as the shooting started here, there was a machine gun position just to the left of here, this area. 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun that immediately swiveled in this direction and began firing a 250 clip rounds in this direction, and that impeded any further entry of the rebels. And it also prohibited the 5 who had gone inside from being able to leave. So they were trapped in there. Skirmish lasted about 20 minutes, and before Castro shouted, retreat, retreat. It was total chaos, total chaos. I spoke with Eduardo Montano Benitez. He's 87 years old. He resides in Passaic, New Jersey today. And he says, I didn't know how to drive. He says, I was looking for my cell leader who drove me there. I couldn't find him. And he said that as soon as they heard one car, the engine roar, he said 13 people crammed into that car. Montano the car was so packed that Montano was only able to get one leg in through the rear door window. And he had one leg in the car, one leg outside, and he was holding on to the door frame. That's how he rode all the way back to Siboney. There was another rebel that was down on the floor on the front part, and he kept mashing the accelerator with his hand. He couldn't even see where they were driving, but he kept mashing it to, it was really a wild scene trying to flee from there. Eventually, the Army threw hand grenades into this area where the rebels were, and 2 of them were killed and 3 captured. Here we see the parade ground in front. This is the main entrance. Okay? And one of the strategic points that the rebels overlooked, and this is why I say this is really terrible intelligence on the part of the rebels, and it was that had they seized this building here, this is a 3-story building in front of, across the street from the garrison. Had they seized that, as one soldier told me, just that would have been a real headache for us, because from that rooftop, they would have been able to silence the machine gun that was firing at them, and any soldiers coming out of the barracks in the front would have been hit by sniper fire. Again, terrible strategic blunder here. Here are some of the strategic errors. And of course, none of these are pointed out in Cuban revolutionary accounts. Okay? But we see, first of all, that the rebels didn't even know the layout of the garrison. They didn't know where the quartermaster room was located or what was in it. They didn't know that Gate 3, you couldn't enter through there between 6 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was prohibited. And what the guard at the gate there told him, he says, look, you can't enter through here. You got to go through the main gate. And this is where the conflict started. See, they thought they were going to disguise themselves. They were going to look like a military unit in civilian cars because they pasted a photograph of Batista on the front windshield, okay? And they had little military flags around the car. Okay? That was the military disguise. The rebels that reached the courthouse, after they reached the courthouse, they went to the roof, and when they went to snipe on the garrison, they noticed that there was a high retaining wall that impeded them shooting at the garrison. They could not fire over the wall. So as a result, one rebel went down to the 3rd floor, fired a few times from a window, but once the garrison responded with a .50 caliber machine gun against that little ping-ping of a .22 caliber rifle, the custodian that they had taken hostage said, boys, it's for real now, you better get out of here. And that's what they did, okay? Again, they failed to occupy that strategic roof across the street. And when the military formed their counteroffensive, as one soldier told me, he said, the first place we occupied was that roof. And he said, you know, had the rebels occupied that, that would have been a headache for the Army. They also lost that surprise factor when that roving patrol appeared on their flank. 5 rebels were trapped inside, okay? And Castro told his followers, oh, you know, once the people hear that we're attacking the garrison, he says, the masses are going to rise up and join us, just like they did in 1868 when they followed Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. They'll have to follow us. The problem was they were wearing Army uniforms. And in the confusion, people in the opposition groups in Santiago who I interviewed said, we didn't know what the heck was going on. We thought it was a coup d'etat by soldiers. And even the civilian population, as Pepín Pujol told me, he says, you know, I was awoken by the milkman. He says, I thought all those shots were the celebration of the Korean War armistice. He says, and then the milkman tells us, oh, it's General Pedraza leading a coup d'etat. So people like Pepín, who were in the opposition, didn't know what was going on. There was no possibility of joining them. By the way, this is a very important photo here. You can see here that the rebels who penetrated the garrison ran up these stairs. You can see the bars on the window here. This is where the quartermaster room was. And the doorway was directly behind the stairway. But they missed it, and they ran up the steps. They entrenched themselves in the barber right here, the officer's barber shop here, and this other office. Now, after the rebels retreated from Gate 3, what occurred was that machine gun that had been firing at them from the center of the parade ground was picked up and placed again right here, over here, in front of the building, and began to fire at them to try to flush them out. But so these bullet holes that you see here were not done by the rebels. There's this, you know, fiction that people think, oh, look what the rebels did. And another interesting aspect of this is that Fidel Castro in 1960 decided to turn the Moncada into a school, and so therefore he knocked down the entire perimeter wall. He had it bulldozed down. But in typical Castro fashion, you know, 23 years later, he decides, I'm going to make a history museum there. So he had the walls rebuilt again to the specific to its specific original size. And after the rebel attack, of course, the holes here were fixed, the garrison was repainted, but if you visit there today, there's holes on that wall again. And there are holes, bullet holes on the railing. So apparently, he shot up the garrison again for aesthetic effects. And there are people who go to Cuba today, and I've seen their photos on the website, and they point to the bullet holes, and they get all excited. But again, I tell them, use your logic. The machine gun, as you can see here, the first shot went upwards and then riddled the windows. But because the rebels inside were lying on the ground, this 45-degree angle, which is going right over their heads. Okay. The group that took over the Palace of Justice, the courthouse here, okay, here's Raul Castro at the time. The group was actually led by Lester Rodriguez, okay, who was from Santiago de Cuba. And what's interesting was that Fidel did not invite his brother Raul to the attack. Raul Castro wrote in his diary that was published in 1963 that it was his friend Jose Luis Tasende who invited him along. Didn't tell him what it was for. Said, let's go to the carnival in Santiago. Once he got there, he told him what the plan was. So Fidel Castro is surprised when he sees his brother at the Siboney farmhouse. So where does he put his brother? Does he put him next to him to charge the gate? No. Does he put him in the civil hospital? No. He puts him in the safest place possible, on the rooftop as a sniper. So when they got up to the rooftop, this is where they find that high retaining wall, and then they flee. They were the first group to flee from the area. Raul Castro is detained the next day, 17 miles away at Dos Caminos, and his detention is interesting because he was detained by Lieutenant Vicente Camps Ruiz, who I had the opportunity to interview. And by the way, the interviews of Lieutenant Camps and all the other people I interviewed, I put them on the internet. So there are transcripts and there are the actual audio recordings of these interviews. And Lieutenant Camps told me that Raul began to tell him that, oh, you know, he made up a name. He says, my brother is the president of Batista's political party in Bahrain. And so he kept saying that he was a peasant, a Guajiro from Bahrain. And so Camps told him to take off his clothes because he wanted to see if he had a wound on his body or if he had some kind of mark on his shoulder from having fired a weapon. So here Raul is claiming he's a peasant, but when he took his clothes off, he was wearing jockey briefs. And Camps told me, he said, you know, peasants in Cuba at the time did not wear jockey briefs. They even compared them to women's panties. So he says, I knew right then he was from the city. He was not a Guajiro, a peasant from Iran. And so this is where he begins the investigation, and eventually Raul Castro confesses his role. Lester Rodriguez, because he lived in the city, he just went home to his parents. And then Raul, who is captured, then assumes the role of leader of the attack. Interestingly enough, Lieutenant Camps gave him a paraffin test to detect if he had fired a handgun, and it proved negative. There was no gunpowder residue on his hands, of course, because the retaining wall prohibited from doing so. I have a list here of the Moncada soldiers that were killed. There were 18 killed there at Moncada, and I have been able to, and you'll read in the book, where I have been able to pinpoint where each fell at, because every time I interviewed a soldier, I would specifically ask them, do you remember this person? Do you remember this person? Where did they fall? Where were they killed? And I was able to come to an agreement with many of them as to what had happened. Okay. At Moncada, 10 rebels were killed in combat. At least 4 were wounded by friendly fire. This is something that the Cuban government does not make mention of. I spoke to doctors who treated the wounded who said that some rebels were wounded by 22 caliber bullets, which the Army did not use. Abelardo Crespo had a 22 caliber bullet in his lung. Pepe Ponce was wounded by 22 caliber in his hand. Reynaldo Benitez was wounded by shotgun pellets on his leg. And Gustavo Arcos told me that he was shot in the back in an upward trajectory, meaning somebody who was ducked behind him shooting at the garrison hit him. Very disorganized. The different rebel cells did not know each other, and they thought that they were soldiers. Here you see a photo of Jose Luis Tasende. He is one of the rebels who went into the garrison. He is later captured. You see here he has a bandage on his leg. He has some shrapnel wounds on his leg. He was captured, wounded, and summarily executed. Remember that small arms target range I previously showed you? The rebels were taken by order of the camp commandant, Colonel Alberto del Rio Chaviano. They were taken to that garrison, to the small arms target range, and executed in groups of 2 and 3. This has been confirmed to me by soldiers and officers who did not agree with the prisoner massacre. And this prompt execution of 51 rebels is what eventually allowed Fidel Castro to turn a humiliating military defeat into a political victory, because he would later use this as propaganda. Here you see Tasende alive, and here he is dead. They have put shoes on him. They put a shotgun next to him. He's been shot here in the head. I can't tell too well here, but his brain matter has been blown out. And he was laid inside. And by the way, this is the barbershop floor. A soldier identified this, checkered square here. He was placed inside the barbershop floor. The rebels were scattered around the garrison after being executed to simulate phony combat. And here, these 2 windows back here was part of one of the offices where those 5 rebels went into, and they began to fire from here through these open windows. These were open barrack windows. And there were soldiers in there who were sleeping in their beds and who got killed in their sleep. And this, of course, raised the ire of some soldiers, and who later sought vengeance for the sneak attack. There were others that did not. But Minister of Information, Ernesto de la Fe, who I interviewed, told me that he told Batista that Colonel del Rio Chaviano should be court-martialed for executing the prisoners. But that Batista basically told him, look, you take care of your ministry, I'll take care of this problem. And he never did anything about it. Okay, here was a simultaneous assault on the Rural Guard barracks. Raul, you look very young here. Okay. Here are the 3 leaders of the group. Raul Martinez Araraz, who's sitting up front here, Orlando Castro Garcia, and Gerardo Perez Puelles. Gerardo Perez Puelles was the military strategist of this attack. okay? He worked for an advertising agency and had a high school education. No military cognition. And they broke with Castro in 1955 after they asked him, where's this movement headed? Is this going to be a democratic movement? And Castro said, no, I am the leader. You know, you will follow me. And they said, no, we will not. And they wrote a public proclamation and broke with him. Here's the part of the Bayamo garrison. Now, 25 rebels gathered here at the Grand Casino Motel. It was a hourly motel, and you rented by the hour. And what's interesting is that the rebels put a note. They put a note on the door saying under repairs, but still there were people coming there and knocking on the door and saying, you know, we want to rent a room, and they're going, no, and say, oh, we don't care the conditions of the room. We just want to rent a room. But this added to the tension of the rebels inside, that, you know, these sporadic knocks on the door from strangers. They didn't know if it was the police. They didn't know who it was. But 4 rebels deserted hours before the attack because Raul spread them out in different rooms. And as you see, all the rooms had side doors for the street exit. And so 4 of them deserted before the attack. And so as they head for the garrison here, you can see on this map where they were holed up. And as they went to the garrison, first they were going to go through the front gate, but had to change plans at the last moment when the local conspirator in town also defected. And so they decided to go around the back. There was barbed wire fence, and so the plan was to quickly cut the back wire fence and try to breach the garrison through the back. They gave a pair of wire cutters to Nico Lopez. Nico Lopez was an illiterate, resentful peon at the market. And they gave him the wire cutters back here, and they said, your job is to cut the barbed wire fence. Well, when they got there, they asked him, okay, Nico, cut the fence. He had forgot the wire cutters back at the motel. So it took them longer to try to breach this objective. When they went into this field, they found out that it was littered with tin cans that the cook would fling out the window. So they started stepping on the tin cans, making a lot of noise, and the dogs started barking, the horses started neighing, and of course this gave the alarm. And what's interesting is that I found that there were only 5 soldiers in this garrison at the time. And 24 years ago, when I first interviewed Raul, I said, Raul, by the way, did you know how many soldiers were in the garrison? He said, no. And I said, do you know that there were only 5 soldiers in there? And he said, my God, he says, we could have taken that with our fists. Again, very bad planning. Again, the master strategist here, Fidel Castro, very bad planning. So the skirmish there lasted 20 minutes, but in contrast to Fidel Castro, Raul did keep control of his rebel force there. They did try to manage a concentrated fire, but as Orlando Castro told me, he said, it was a surreal sound, that little pinging of our .22 caliber rifles, that ping, ping, and that thud, 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 thud of the machine gun firing at them. Only 1 rebel was wounded. Gerardo Perez Puelles was wounded in thigh. It was a clean shot. And as he told me, he says, when he got hit, he thought that the rebel next to him had kicked him. So he snarled at him, hey, get over there. Didn't realize he had been wounded. There were 2 soldiers wounded, but, of course, Nico Lopez, 15 minutes after the attack, look, they were already at this point here. Nico Lopez was here. He saw a Jeep with a police sergeant coming this way. And Nico murdered the police officer. There was no reason to kill that man. And Nico just gunned him down. I guess he wanted to go back and say, yeah, I killed somebody. Well, what comes around goes around. During the Granma expedition, Nico Lopez was killed. And of course, because the 3 rebel leaders of the Bayamo attack went into exile in broke with Castro in 55, later went into exile. Well, guess who is the revolutionary leader now of the Bayamo attack? Yeah, Nico Lopez. And there's a park there named for him. There's a bust of Nico Lopez there. So it's part of that revisionist history, kind of like Alice in Wonderland. Okay, after the Moncada attack failed, 45 rebels returned to the Siboney farmhouse here from Santiago. Okay, now, only 18 by now trusted Castro enough to follow him to the hills. But Castro then, after 2 days, he divides the group and remains with only 7 followers. And during the entire next week, he spends a week just going around in circles here. You see, I've marked 1, 2, 3. These are all the different places. He kept going around in circles here. He never ventured beyond 5 miles because by that time, you know, he could have walked to Havana, but instead he just kind of stayed in the area, hoping that there would be some kind of political solution, that he'd be able to surrender, that his life would be spared, as it was, and that he would become a hero. And I know, Pepin, I know you've been throughout this whole area here, La Gran Piedra. Okay, Fidel Castro belonged to the Belen explorers. He grew up and he went to this area. He knew his way there. So for him to go around, he was doing it on purpose. He was just waiting for this. And of course, years later, he claimed, no, we went to the hills to start a guerrilla warfare. Not with 7 men. They didn't even have a first aid kit, no survival equipment, nothing. Castro, after 5 days later, meandering in the woods, he and the several rebels reached the farm of Manuel Laysan. They were hiding in this rural shack, and it is there that they heard that a reprieve had been given for the rebels, that their lives would be spared. Laysan then goes into the city and he informed Archbishop Enrique Perez Serantes that the rebels wanted to give themselves up, and Lieutenant Pedro Sarria was sent out to the farmhouse with 15 soldiers to detain them. After they are captured, here you see Fidel. Here is Eduardo Montano, who today lives in New Jersey. Here is Almeida, and others. And this is Mario Chanes all the way on the end here. Okay. Castro and the 7 rebels are taken to the city jail. 48 rebels managed to escape. Of the 99 that were left alive, 48 managed to escape. Here's Castro as he's being interrogated. Here's Lieutenant Sarria here. This was the police chief, Jose Izquierdo, and this is the Colonel del Rio Chaviano. By the way, Jose Izquierdo was, his brother was killed there at Gate 3. He's the corporal that rang the alarm. And as Mario Chanes told me, he said he was very surprised that when Izquierdo came to see them, he says, that man shook our hand, each one of us. He says, and I thought, would I have done the same thing if it was the other way around? So, so this is a good contrast here, okay? Here you have a police chief who does not take reprisals against the prisoners who have killed his brother. Yet here's the commandant who, by the way, his participation in the attack and all, he didn't even lead the defense of the garrison, was in total contrast, especially ordering the execution of the prisoners. Okay. What's interesting, and here's Commandant Morales, who Rafael Morales led the defense of the garrison. His son is here, Rafaelito, who I interviewed in New York City. Here's Castro after his capture. And what's interesting is that when all the rebels were given paraffin tests to detect if they had fired a weapon, Castro was the only one that refused. He told the medical examiner, it will not be done to me. He says, you put on there that it's positive because I did fire. And if you don't believe me, find a weapon, you'll see how I continue to fire. So why this braggadocio, right? Apparently, he did not even have the opportunity to fire during that brief skirmish at Gate 3. And as I asked a number of the rebels who were with them, including Montano, Mario Chanes, Héctor de Armas, Jaime Costa Chavez, and Carlos Bustillo, I said, did you see Castro there? He said, yeah, I saw him. Was he armed? Yes, he had a Luger. Did you see him fire? No. So, and then I said, who did you fire at? Most of them said, well, I had about 4 or 5 bullets, and there were shadows in the windows, and I fired at those. So there wasn't even a target which to shoot at. So in all likelihood, had the paraffin test been done and proven that Castro, the leader of the attack, did not fire a shot in which 61 of those under him were killed, he would have been totally discredited. So this is why he refused. Okay? The defendants spent 2 months in Boniato prison. They did receive a speedy trial. It was a public trial, there was press coverage, and there were 65 civilians implicated and 51 rebels. Okay. Fidel Castro assumed his own defense without limitations. He lied under oath repeatedly to win the acquittal of 19 rebels. I interviewed Magistrate Adolfo Nieto y Piñeiro Osorio, who told me, he says, I can guarantee you that no innocent person was convicted. He said, yeah, I knew that a number of those guilty got away, but he said the military botched the evidence gathered against them. Again, it's very interesting. Castro has never complained, or any of the rebels, they never complained about their sentence, they never complained about the treatment, they never complained that they were railroaded. And when Castro gave his now renowned defense speech, which is titled "History Will Absolve Me," and that has become a signature phrase. But that, in fact, was fabricated while he wrote his defense in prison. He never actually pronounced that. And the first indication I got of that was when I started this research, I found in Bohemia magazine of December 27th, 1953, page 70, that there were some quotes. Oh, sound went out. Sound man? I'm okay? All right. I found that they had quoted Castro's speech in Bohemia, the last few paragraphs. And what he actually said was, not history will absolve me. He told the tribunal, he says, "You count with the backing of the people of Cuba today. The silence does not matter. History will definitively say it all." That's how he ended. That was published in Bohemia in 1953. He doesn't publish. Later, he writes "History Will Absolve Me" while he's in prison. But the urgency tribunal under which they were tried did not keep trial transcripts. So that's why there is no transcript of this trial. And the 6 journalists that were there wrote in longhand. They did not write in shorthand. So they were not able to capture every single word. And one of them, Marta Rojas, was able to compile from all the others, try to compile Castro's defense speech. It was sent to him in prison, and then he was able to revise it and send it out to Miguel Ángel Quevedo, the editor of Bohemia, to revise it more, and intellectual Jorge Mañach, who ended up doing another revision. So the final version, there have been a number of versions of "History Will Absolve Me," and his signature phrase there was never published. Magistrate Adolfo Nieto acknowledged this. Lieutenant Vicente Camps, who took him from jail to the courthouse, also acknowledges he was present during the trial. Now, when they were imprisoned, they received humane treatment. They had very special privileges as political prisoners. They were segregated from common criminals. They didn't wear prison uniforms. They didn't have to do any kind of labor. They just kind of laid around all day, reading books, listening to the radio. As you see here, they received a special visit here from some nuns. They had conjugal visits, uncensored books. They had recreation radios. They even had interviews. The press went there to interview them. And for those of you that have read about Cuba's political prisons today, you'll see that that treatment is in radical, marked contrast. Batista approved a general amnesty that was passed by Congress in May of 1955. The rebels then served 22 months for the deaths of 19 soldiers and policemen. Castro then organized in Mexico the Granma expedition. Only 22 of the surviving 99 rebels now joined him. That also says a lot about how many of them had faith in Castro. Okay. Here is another important fact. This is the next to last slide here. The American Embassy in Havana, that was following all these events very closely, okay, wrote to the State Department in Washington, D.C., describing Fidel Castro as, quote, "an extremely ambitious and ruthless opportunist, obviously not adverse to violence when it serves his purpose." 1953, folks, and of course this warning was ignored in 1958 when the State Department changed its Cuba policy in favor of the rebels and demanded the resignation of Fulgencio Batista. This is how they had seen Castro in 1953. And this is kind of a good indication of U.S.-Cuba relations, how they go from one extreme to another in just a short span of 5 years. Before, they consider him a ruthless opportunist, not averse to violence when it serves his purpose. And then he is a Robin Hood and a rebel hero. Who were those that mostly benefited from the revolution? Of course, it was this new military and social elite that had failed under capitalism. And they included Juan Almeida, seen here today, who's worth over $10 million. This guy was an assistant bricklayer. That meant he carried the bricks and mixed the cement. So he aspired to be a bricklayer. I mean, nothing wrong with that profession, but it just shows you that he did not have much ambition in life. Calixto Garcia Martinez, a Johnson Pharmacy bicycle messenger, right, Raul? Yeah, Raul's the one that told me that. This is the guy that when you call the drugstore and said, hey, send me up a bottle of aspirin, this guy got on the bicycle and pedaled there and brought it up 5 flights. Also today, very, very wealthy. And it's interesting to note when he speaks about, there's a book that came out in Cuba a couple of years ago called Secretos de Generales, where he talks about his background. Well, he says that he worked in the pharmacy, you know, but not peddling. Ramiro Valdez over here, again, another one of the leaders of the revolution today. He used to be a truck driver's helper. This is the guy that loaded the Coca-Cola crates onto the truck and injured his knee while doing so. Again, and by the way, at this time he was unemployed because he had injured his knee. Again, he did not have a bright future waiting for him other than to get involved in the revolution. There's Orlando Castro Garcia. I see his wife back there. Joey, is Orlando here? ¿Dónde está? Chino. I don't see him. Probably in the back. Okay, here's his image here, in case if you happen to see him out there. There he is, coming through the doorway. Say hello, Orlando. Thank you. But there's a lot of talk in Cuba today about reconciliation. But actually, the reconciliation occurred here in Miami in exile. This is where the reconciliation goes on. Because as you see from this picture, Orlando Castro Garcia, the second in command of the attack on Bayamo barracks there, is with Private Ariel Matos, who was a defender of the Moncada garrison. And I was a guest on this TV program where they appeared. And when I saw them shake hands, these former adversaries, it reminded me of a special gathering at Gettysburg on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg of the American Civil War. And there, former Confederates and former Union soldiers met and embraced and shook hands in reconciliation as Americans. And I saw this happen here in Miami. It does not happen in Cuba. It's happened here in Miami. And in that program, Orlando stated, if we continue with those errors, lacking maturity and a sense of historic responsibility, Cuba will never be a civilized republic. We have to tread the path of political solutions every time that is possible. I hope someday his vision becomes a reality. Thank you. All right, thank you. Pepín Pujol just pointed out that he's a former revolutionary, and he's sitting next to a former commandant of the Navy during Batista's time. This is where true reconciliation takes place. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
I have a couple of questions. What was the role of Manuel Urrutia, who you do not mention, and he later became president of the Republic, and I know that he had something to do with the trial of the Moncada. Also, there's something that doesn't really make much sense to me, is the fact that Castro, when he was taken prisoner, and he says, I refuse to take the paraffin test. And how can he refuse something if he's a prisoner? I mean, it just
well,
makes...
this was a forensic doctor that came to see him. A forensic doctor took all of the, and actually, I mean, if you're a prisoner, like the two women who were involved in this, Aide Santa Maria and Mel Hernandez, they immediately began demanding, take our paraffin test to prove. The whole purpose of the paraffin test is to prove whether you fired or not to use in court. So by Castro saying, hey, I fired, you know, you don't have to take my paraffin test, I fired, go ahead, put that in. He's already acknowledging guilt. As far as Manuel Urrutia, I explain in the book that, and I go into detail on this, there's a lot of confusion because Urrutia was later the president of the tribunal that tried the Granma expeditionaries in 1957. But in 1953, there were 4 courts in Santiago de Cuba during the summer. There were, I believe, 2 criminal courts and 2 civil courts. And during the hot months of the summer, they went into vacation. So 2 of the courts did not function. And the 2 that functioned were called vacation courts because of summer vacation. And so Urrutia presided the vacation court that took in the testimony and the evidence for the forthcoming trial. So in September, when the trial started, all he did was present the evidence, present the documentation, the statements that he had taken as president of the summer vacation court. And when the regular courts went back in session in September, all 4 courts started again. The criminal court, one of the criminal courts functioning as an urgency tribunal. And I know this gets a little complicated, but some of you who know the judicial system in Cuba are familiar with what I'm talking about. And I explained this in detail. So Urrutia then no longer is involved in this process. It is now the 3 other magistrates headed by Adolfo Nieto, who presides the tribunal. Yes?
My name is Rolando Perez. I'm the son of Dr. Rolando Perez de la Peña.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And we lived in the corner.
Right, in the corner house.
In the corner house right next to the children's nursery.
Right, the creche that was there.
I remember perfectly, to this day, what I heard that morning at around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. Shoot him, kill him. And when...
I know what you're talking, I know exactly what you're talking about.
They had guys in the front porch of the house that we lived. It was my mom, myself, and a maid. My father had fortune being called to the hospital in emergency surgery of a soldier that got shot in a bar. And my father had that operated on him for 5 hours.
That's all. If you read my book, I interviewed your father back in '75. I have his entire account in the book, and what you heard when you heard that shoot him, kill him, what had happened was that when a group of rebels arrived there,
No, a group of rebels were in my
Right.
car. They tried to get into my house.
I'll tell you who they were.
And then across the street
Right.
on the
I will-
Victoria Bakery, they were hiding behind
Right.
a sign. And the guy that also killed the 2 in the hospital, civil hospitals, the guy from Colón, that was a doctor, he wrote himself with a piece of tape.
Right.
Dr. Munoz.
Mario Muñoz Monroy.
And then as the soldiers walked by, none of them were armed, he shot him. And a nurse told on him because he was trying to hide in the civil hospital.
Okay, let me address a couple of those issues. The rebels that you heard were the Ferraz brothers, and Armando, Antonio, and another brother. And I mentioned this in detail in the book. What happened was that Hector de Armas, who later came into exile and I interviewed, was driving the car. He stopped on the street on the other side of where your family lived. The 3 Ferraz brothers got out. They thought it was part of the garrison. They went into the backyard. At that moment, Corporal Nemesio Traba Montero stepped off a bus right there on the corner of Garzón and Moncada Street, where your residence was. He stepped out of the bus. He was a big, tall person, and he came out with his gun in his hand. He saw them, and he said, you know, what's going on here? How can I help? These rebels were intimidated, and they shot him in the back twice, the Ferraz brothers.
Over, him, that first soldier, and another one when in front of my dad, that was the representative for Menem and Eli Lilly Labs, came for us. Because the guy that was on the side of the house ran across the street and I was peeking out the window. It's the best, you know, thought of things. And I saw the guy that came out, just went over the wall, like, you know, riding horse with a rifle, running across the street to an empty lot that was right next to the hospital.
I don't know if you've seen the interview.
Trying to go to the Justice Palace. And from the Justice Palace, they were shooting at the hospital all the time. Because where the two surgery rooms were, it was glass blocks. And every time they saw a shadow, they shot them. But they were low, you know, caliber weapons, so it didn't just shatter the glass on the other side. And in the hospital were 3 dead. The guy in the pharmacy, the switchboard operator that was reading a comics book, a guy that was switchboard operator, probably wet and fully dressed, didn't weigh more than 120 pounds. I swapped comic books with him. And he got shot. He wasn't armed. He got shot in the head. And then they shot at my dad as he came out of the drunkard's room with Eddie Juanpita, and a sergeant led the charge, and then they chased the guys.
Your father explained this to me. His interview can be found on the internet.
Okay.
You can hear his voice there. You can see
that would be great.
the transcript. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question and an anecdotal commentary. The question is, in your presentation, a very elegant presentation, you mentioned a name that was associated with Castro from the early days, Rafael Del Pino. My question is that the same Rafael Del Pino who became a pilot?
No.
And is in exile?
No, that's a different one. Rafael Del Pino was locked up in Cuba in July of 1959, and he died in prison in 1977. The Castro regime alleged that he hung himself.
The anecdotal comment is that I was 8 years old in Santiago de Cuba when the Moncada attack, and I still vividly remember the slow-paced staccato of the 50 caliber machine gun to this day, and after that sounded, the shooting stopped.
I forgot something. The military intelligence, the guy in charge of that was Labastida. That was
Agustín Labastida, El Bebo.
We got through an informant that suspected it was Dark because he owed money in a casino that they controlled.
That whole account is in my book.
3 days,
Yeah.
because I went to the movies at the Garrison and I was scared out because every day we're waiting for something.
That whole account is in my book. So you can purchase the book here, and I'll do a book signing. Yeah, Henry?
Just a quick question on the influence of the Spanish Jesuits on Fidel Castro. I don't think that you really got into that.
Yeah, I didn't get into that. I mentioned it in the book. Don't forget, these were Spaniards that had just fled from Spain. They were very pro-fascist, pro-Franco, so they did inculcate that in Fidel Castro initially. He was an admirer of Mussolini, his gesticulations. So I saw that in the book. Thank you. Okay, gracias. Mucho gusto.
Antonio Rafael de la Cova, a native of Havana, is a Latin Studies professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. He's also author of Cuban Confederate Colonel, The Life of Ambrosio Jose Gonzalez. For more information on the Moncada attack, visit sc.edu/USC Press.